Now you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown episode 2. It is the podcast that looks at the XG and performance of Celtic FC. We're getting a little bit deeper into Celtic's performances and mainly talking about the defence, the key issue of Celtic's performances this year. And I'm joined on the line, as always, by Juco James and by Alan Morrison, aka Celtic by Numbers. Alan, we'll start with you. A very easy question to start off. What is going wrong with Celtic's defence this year?
It's a very easy question and probably quite a long answer. I think we're going to focus on a couple of things today, but obviously we've got new personnel. We've got the same problems we have every season. It seems where the centre-back pairing gets is not a stable combination. Embedding in new players, the key combination of Julian and I are being absent. But then I think we'll also probably get onto things like fundamentally is the team structured and set up in a way that's going to give us the best chance to keep goals out, frankly.
I do think that there is a broader conversation when we're talking about the defence that the midfield definitely plays a role in it, but we're not going to go that deep into it because we want to focus really on the three key defenders, and that is Chris Julian, Christopher Ayer, and Shane Duffy as well, the new man. I should say that we are all on Twitter as well. You can follow all of us, Juco James, Celtic by Numbers, I'm Enda Coll, and also the Huddle Breakdown is on Twitter as well. Just search the handle Huddle Breakdown and you can follow it. That's where we'll be posting all the content over the next couple of weeks. James, so we're looking at a new man in the Celtic defence, and I know that you had an issue with the signing of Shane Duffy initially. So explain that. Why don't you think Shane Duffy suited Celtic to begin with?
Sure. So one of the basic things I do is from an analytics perspective is benchmarking. It's kind of a analytics 101 concept. So one of the things I did when the rumors started about Shane Duffy was look at, and there was, some discussion at the time as far as whether we would be making 3-5-2, playing three at the back as the primary shape for this season. And so I started to look at proxies. What clubs in Europe are using three defenders at the back, and what do the profiles look like for those types of players? Meaning that Inter Milan, for example, or Hoffenheim, Atalanta, 3-4-1-2, 3-4-2-1 have become more in vogue, particularly with some analytics-heavy clubs. Even Brendan Rodgers has started to use it a little bit at Leicester. So I basically looked at what the profile looked like for a right center back or a left center back, and neither Julian nor Duffy really fit that. In fact, to me, Duffy profiled very similar to Julian. So the fit to me never really made sense if we were going to make 3-5-2 our primary shape. Otherwise, Duffy would then become a depth player because I didn't think he was, better than Julian, and certainly not better than Ayer. And then the question becomes, well, why are we allocating resources for one of our, kind of primary summer transfer window people to a depth piece instead of improving the starting 11. So it just didn't make sense to me from the start once I did that kind of benchmarking and proxying. And it looked to me like almost like a Back to the Future, which seems to be a theme with Lennon, as far as maybe looking more towards reconstituting a similar back three as what the glory days with under Martin O'Neill. So that was kind of how I viewed it.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one because I suppose a lot of people see three at the back as quite a modern invention, but it's not. It's been there for a while. People have tried it. It's also it's almost like a reinvention of what the AC Milan teams did in the 90s, and it's sort of developed a little bit further than that. There are a couple of things before we get into the stat that we do need to explain for the listeners and for the viewers. So there's going to be a couple of words and lingo stats talk that you need to sort of explain to the listeners, Alan. So we're going to be looking at key points when we're talking about Shane Duffy and comparing them to other defenders from the Ronnie Deila era all the way up to the Neil Lennon era, and also with the current crop of defenders that Celtic have. So we have the defensive action success rate and the defensive action possession win. So can you explain what the difference are between those and what those actually mean?
Of course, yeah. So if you're on YouTube, you'll be seeing some nice, pretty diagrams. If you're not, I'll try and explain the words, the pictures in words. So defensive action success rate is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it's a percentage. So on the positive side, you've got things like the number of tackles won, the number of heading duels won, interceptions, etc. And on the other side, the negative side, you've got obviously tackles lost, headers lost, missed blocks and things like that. So it's a ratio between the two, and you're really looking for a high percentage, especially for a centre back, because centre backs obviously are the deepest and most central players in the team, and therefore you want them to be pretty much winning nearly all their duels if you can, because otherwise you're going to be very exposed. So a high number is good. Possession win percentage is really is a bit of overlap, but essentially it's not just looking, did you win the tackle, but actually did you win the tackle and Celtic kept possession. So it's the percentage of your actions that result in your team keeping possession of the ball, because again, possession, there's no point flying into tackles if you're constantly giving the ball away, because then you're in transition, and then that's a real dangerous situation. So what I do is I plot both of those, and it gives a pretty good indication of overall defensive soundness. So obviously it's not looking at players in totality in terms of all of their attributes. It's purely looking at defensive actions. And when I'm sort of plot those two variables, the defensive action success rate, possession win percentage, it actually meets the eye test quite well in terms of, you get at the top right-hand corner with the players with very high ratios, which is good. You get players like Van Dijk, Ayer, Julian, Benkovic. In the middle, the sort of middle class, you get players like Sviatchenko, Simunovic, Boyata, even Denier, but remember he was very young. And then in the sort of bottom left, the sort of corner of sadness, you get Hendry and Ambrose. So in terms of the eye test, it kind of these numbers I think do kind of pass that.
We need to start a new segment called the Corner of Sadness for any time a player has
the
a
bottom
really
left
bad
corner of sadness.
Yeah. James, what are you looking for then? Do you go along the same sort of lines, or is there anything else that you're looking for in a defender in terms of their attributes?
Sure. So Alan adeptly summarized some of the defensive aspects. I think that the key, and this comes back to the question of fit with Duffy relative to Celtic, meaning that given the disparity between a Brighton in the English Premier League and their style of play relative to Celtic, and then being a possession dominant attacking side with playing a high line, when you go back to looking at profiles of teams that play three at the back, if you're going to have a right or a left center back, ball progression is an important aspect. Passing, being able to advance the ball, break lines, dribble out. That's obviously what Ayer excels at, is breaking lines through dribbling, progressive runs. So there's all these terminologies that it's really a language of analytics, but they're very commonsensical. I mean, a progressive pass or a pack pass is basically taking out defensive lines and progressing the ball. And the idea is you're just basically getting more attackers relative to the number of defenders by taking out those players. And what you look at is, and what you see is that Duffy is not very good in those areas of the game, and we've certainly seen that through his time already at Celtic. And I always joke, the eye test is important, but I think that this is where we get into where analytics is important as well. So when I first started looking at Duffy, I got romanticized a little bit by looking at some of his Y-Scout clips, because I was evaluating his long passing. And there's, as with any player, if you look at 5 years of history of long passes, there's going to be some that are pretty good. So there's, it's always confirmation bias. I looked at it, I was like, wow, some of these are really great.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, maybe he's a better passer than what the numbers are showing me, or some of the third-party independent analysts, scouts that I had read some reports on Duffy, and it just goes to show that we can be irrational when we view things, and our eyes can trick us at times and make us want to see things that that aren't necessarily there. So the other aspect of looking at defenders, and Alan touched upon that as far as the distinction with possession win, and this was also pretty evident in the data, is that Duffy is quite wild in his aerial behavior. So that can flatter to deceive in ways. so that, you know, in corners, for example, he gets to more balls than, let's say, Julian, but the efficiency of his heading is actually lower. So his XG per shot, let's say. So actually their overall XG is very similar in their history, even if you look at Julian's time at Toulouse versus Duffy's time at Brighton. So they're both very good in the air, but Julian is a little more controlled. And I think we see that defensively as well with Duffy, where he attacks a lot of balls in the air, but as Allen data captures with that possession win percentage, he heads a lot of them to the other team because he's just booming them out of there.
In the opposition box, it's called bravery. Right. In your own box, it's recklessness, or because you're really. It's not just that you are chasing something that perhaps you can't get. You're actually disrupting the whole defensive shape.
Yeah, you're throwing yourself about.
That's a real issue.
What it's called.
There was an incident. There's a corner in the Lille game where the ball is nearly at the back post and it's possibly drifting out of play, and Bain's got it covered. And Bain actually tipped it out for another corner, but he got absolutely wiped out by Duffy. Why was Duffy chasing that? And that's just one little snippet of what he does. Because if you actually look at where we talked about the defensive action success, possession win, where would Duffy be on that benchmark? He would actually be kind of in the middle, which isn't disastrous, right? We're not talking Jack Henry here, who wasn't of the standard needed, but he's a young kid. He's kind of in the middle when you average it all out. But the problem is, if you look at the centre-back profile that Celtic generally buy young central defenders who hopefully mature into better players, or occasionally they'll buy a very experienced pro like a Toure. But and that's why the Julian signing was fascinating, because actually he was coming into his prime from an age profile, and he cost a lot of money, and he's been a fantastic success. So I'm not saying do that all the time, but clearly that worked, but it was very different. Now Duffy is more, as James says, Duffy is more like what Julian should be. He's 28 years old. He should be in his prime. He got 80 or whatever, how many caps for Ireland, and he's EPL. He's EPL experienced. It all sounds perfect, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think where it comes in and where the context comes into Duffy is that for his career, and he was very much a player who thrived on being a leader within a team that were backs to the wall the entire time. And now that he is coming into his prime, he's being asked to do something that is brand new to him, in both for country and club as well, because Ireland have completely revamped the way that they want to play. So there's more demands on him that way. And there's also more demands on him at a club level. What I found interesting with Duffy was that he was playing on the right side of the three. And I immediately thought that makes absolutely no sense, because if you're playing a back three, you want the two players playing to the left and the right to be the ball playing defenders that are going to be carrying the ball out of the defense. And then the center back is the guy who's there to, when your back's to the walls. And I thought Julian was a better suit to the right side and Shane Duffy to the center, but that's not how it's worked out. In terms of the actual numbers, when we're comparing and contrasting the three defenders, so the three key terms that we talked about there, the defensive action success rate, Shane Duffy has a 74% success rate, Chris Julian has 78%, and Christopher Ayer has 73%. And then in the possession wins, Shane Duffy has 90%, and Chris Julian has 83%, and Christopher Ayer has 86%. So the numbers aren't amazingly different there, but I suppose one of the key numbers that you're looking at then is the error rate, and Shane Duffy's is much higher than the other two defenders.
Absolutely. So I'll just say that Julian and Ayer's performances this season, and bear in mind Julian's not played a lot, are actually down a bit. And I think that's probably more of an interesting and wider conversation about just the whole efficacy of the Celtic defence this season versus last, right? So if you compare their careers, he's quite a long way behind Julian and Ayer in terms of their Celtic career. Again, small sample. But where the differentiator with Duffy, who's I suppose a kind of middle-class defender when we expected to be buying a top-end defender, is that error rate. And again, for those on YouTube, defensive errors per 90 minute, if I'm saying what does good look like, well, the average is about 0.6 per 90 minutes, which means you're making one sort of one real bad error every other game. If you want to know what bad looks like, then you're looking at Ambrose, which is over one a game. Duffy is actually 1.2 a game, and he's actually eclipsing Ambrose, Toure, Bitton, Boyata, who were all kind of seen as being error prone. Duffy is way over that and into red territory. And if you look at some of the incidents in some of the big games, because he had a nice start, right? Ross County, Livingston, Riga away. It was a nice start for him. He scored a couple of goals, and we all thought, oh, this is going to be good. But then when you actually look at him in the games that matter, the games against the Rangers, the games against Milan and Lille, this is where Celtic players really need to be judged. And then certain themes start to come in when you look at his play. He's getting pulled out of position. There's a number of instances where, especially as the right-sided player, he's trying to compensate for the fact that he thinks Frimpong's going to lose a header, right? And this is defending 101. I mean, you do your job, okay, and you trust your teammates to do their job. And if you think that Frimpong's going to lose a header, which let's face it, you probably will, then you let him lose the header, and you're there, and you anticipate where that second ball is going to be, and more often than not, you'll cut out the danger. But he goes looking for work. He's, if anything, I guess it's overreach. I guess you'd call it, right? Overreach is one of his biggest issues. And whether he's doing that because that's how he plays, I don't know, or whether he's really desperate to impress and he's just effectively, let's call it, trying too hard, I don't know. But what it causes systemic breakdown in the whole defence when that happens. And two of the goals against Aberdeen that we conceded were down to that. The whole defensive structure broke down because Duffy went chasing the ball. There's no doubt that he's been a little bit unlucky in the sense that every time he does something like that and he does do something stupid, we seem to concede a goal, and that isn't always the case, but it does seem to be happening that way. I mean, he was badly exposed against Milan, where again, overcompensating to cover for Welsh, who actually had been pretty solid to that point, and Frimpong, who were kind of a bit exposed on the right. Again, by overcompensating, Ibrahimovic had so much space to drop deep, turn and feed people in. It was just a masterclass in that respect. But he probably couldn't believe his luck.
There was an interesting conversation had at the beginning, and it was a clip that sort of went viral, and it even made it to the Celtic press conference. It actually came from the place where I work off the ball. Gary Breen, the former Ireland international, said that Shane Duffy would go up to Scotland and absolutely dominate. And he said that he worried about his international form because he wouldn't be coming up against the quality of player week in, week out. And that is largely true when you're talking about the Ross Counties, the Kilmarnocks, and even as low down as Hibernian. But the difference, and I suppose it's sort of a false prophecy when you're buying a Premier League defender, is that he never would have come up against AC Milan playing for Brighton. He never would have. He wasn't expected to be in the first half of the table in the Premier League. He was playing for a team that were very much surviving relegation. So Celtic, Rangers, AC Milan, Europa League, that is a level above where Shane Duffy has ever played. So that is more context to where his performances may actually lie against these teams. This is the highest level that he's played at because, number one, he can't make a mistake, because once he makes a mistake, that's it. And that's where he's going to get judged, and that's where he's going to come down and be criticised by players and by fans for his performances. James, your overall view on where Duffy's at in comparison to the other defenders in the Celtic team at the minute?
Yes, I want to offer a little bit of hope. And I think, given, as Alan said, the level of sample size that we're dealing with here is relatively small. There's some extenuating circumstances with Duffy in his personal life. He didn't play all that much over the last year. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that error rate is something that could mean revert. As an analytics geek speak, would mean that he could go through as they say, a purple patch here for an extended period where his error rate really drops. So if you think about average, he's been absolutely terrible so far. For him to get back to an error rate, he'd have to go through a period of time where he's actually better than average to kind of balance it out. So, and I think that's a general theme for Celtic that I think overall, and I'm still very concerned about some of these structural issues, but we've been so bad over the last month, to 6 weeks in so many different ways that there's some reasonable hope that we will have a pickup in a variety of things. So things like error rate, can certainly mean revert and get better. Finishing can get better. Some of these other things that are kind of plaguing us, even if we have the same structural issues in midfield that we've had, for example, you know, we might be playing players in position better than we did earlier in the season. You know, midfielders not playing at striker and two striker systems, that kind of thing. So I think there's actually some optimism in the intermediate term here relative to Duffy. I think the bigger question comes back to who's first choice relative to the shape. And I think that's where Alan's done a lot of great work on kind of the Julian Ayer pairing and how elite that has been within the historical context. So to me, if we're going to stay with a back four, I don't really think it's that difficult of a decision to make who should be, assuming Julian gets back to being fit. But I don't have a lot of confidence that that's going to be the decision that's made. And I think that we come back to this issue of decision making at the club, who's making the decisions and whether those decisions have been good ones or not. And that's, you know, I keep coming back to this over and over again, which is I just keep seeing decisions made that aren't well grounded from an analytics perspective. And I think that would be an example. I mean, if we go back to Duffy, you know, it's going to take some time for Julian to get back up to speed. But if he's fully fit, all three of them are fully fit, do I have confidence that they're going to play the right players, quote unquote? You know, the arrogance of my that I know who the right players are, but the evidence is there. And I think it definitively should be Julian with Ayer.
Yeah, I think that's what surprised a lot of people was that when Julian was fit, it was still Shane Duffy that was starting in the team. And maybe it is time to give Shane Duffy a rest and let his head get back to normal and let his confidence sort of regroup, because he hasn't been having a good time at all this year. So I definitely think...
Can I interject on it? Because
Cool.
This goes back to one of the issues with, you know, I never understood this obsession with Julian basically having one or two bad games on turf against Dykes, right? And he gets this label that he gets bullied by strikers. You know, and you compare that to his performances against Rangers in the Cup final, Rangers all three games last season, his performance against Lazio, Rennes. I mean, he had a terrific season last year. And he had a pedigree coming in from Toulouse that was completely supported by his data as well. So to have this theme developed, it seems to be even have been, you know, I don't know, we've heard people at the club say things about this as well. Like, you know, and if you look at some third-party analysts that have done some reporting on, like Jamie Finley at Modern Football did a piece on you know, Julian's time at Celtic and how he gets left exposed. I mean, we know this. We've seen this with Duffy right now as well. Mm-hmm. This is not unique to Julian, where if the fullbacks are bombing forward and the midfield's a mess, your center backs are going to get exposed sometimes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And throw in the AstroTurf that they're not used to playing on, weird bounces and guys that are used to it. And, you know, Dykes is a competent striker. He's a physical, tough guy. So that's a tough matchup. So the fact that we surrender 2 or 3 goals in an entire season within that context and that we need to replace Julian because of that, I think is madness. Just madness. I never understood it. I think it was crazy decision-making if that was actually a root driver and catalyst for this. And that's where I come back to it's an either or. Either we were misshapen and we were going to go 3 at the back with those 3 players, which didn't make any sense to me, or we were bringing in Duffy to replace Julian, which is probably even worse from a decision-making perspective.
Yeah. Julian's the inverse of Duffy in the sense that his mistakes are against the Ross Counties and the Kilmarnocks. His concentration dips against lesser opposition, and that's probably why he didn't play for a team higher up in the French league. But against the better teams in the Europa League and in the big matches in Scotland, he was virtually error-free, Julian. He was immense, and his game stepped up incredibly. And he's got a partnership with Ayer that, as I say, that according to the benchmarking stats that I use, is the best that we've had since Van Dijk and Denayer. And, you know, Van Dijk is repeatedly the best defender in the world, and Denayer, you know, plays for Lyon and is a regular in the Belgian team. We were ranked first in the world, so you know that's a pretty good benchmark, I would say. And Julian and I are in that sort of space. But I agree with James, and I don't want this to turn into a Duffy bashing session. As I say, there's some poor recruitment choices there, and there's also some structural issues, which I'll echo. When you think about Celtic under Rodgers, and even before, you had Lustig at right back, who is first and foremost a defender, and his other key skill was that his long passing was excellent. So he could sit deep and still take Celtic forward. And when Tierney bombed forward on the other side, he could shuffle in, and effectively he could form a three. And secondly, you had Tierney on the other side. Tierney was obviously a very attacking player, but he's like Christie and McGinn. He's just got incredible energy, and actually Tierney had that wonderful gift for not overcomplicating his defending. He defended to first principles, and if he had to kick the ball out, he'd kick the ball out. If he had to just put it up the park, he'd put it up the park. He didn't complicate the game like Duffy is doing. But Duffy, Julian Ayer don't have that framework to work within. They've got two fullbacks now who are essentially wing backs who are bombing forward. There's Brown can't cover both sides. He can barely cover the middle, frankly. And so and actually this as we saw against Lille, that Lille second half to me was one of the most alarming things I've seen in terms of structural defensive issues for Celtic. And the reason I say that is, because everyone thinks, oh, that was a great result. Lille are a top team, they're joint top of the French league. They've spent millions on players. They had an array of talent on the pitch, and we got a draw. Isn't that fantastic? And actually in the first half, we looked like a really good Europa League side. We went 2-0 up. We maximised our chances. But in that second half was an absolute shambles of game management. And it really started with the fact that the spacing between the midfield and the defence was too great. We actually got, so James mentioned packing, and again, apologies, I'll just very simply. So packing would be if I passed to James and you were the defender, Enda, and the ball went past you, so that you're now behind the ball. Effectively, I've packed you. I've taken you out of the game. You're now not impacting the game. The ball's now in sort of behind you in that sense. So obviously, the more players you can take out of the game, the less defenders between you and the goal. Right? It's a very simple concept. Celtic had their whole Celtic had their whole midfield packed, taken out of the game by a single pass 11 times between when they scored their second goal and the 60th minute. I mean, that's just incredible. That is just a fundamental failure, systemic failure to set your team up in a competent way. The spacing was too great. There was too large of a gap, which weren't aligned properly. After 15 minutes of the second half, Lille had completed 117 passes and Celtic completed 5. We'd completely lost control of a game that you're 2-0 up, and you should be controlling. You should be compact. You should be tight. You should be, taking your time at throw-ins, all these nasty, horrible things you should be doing when you're 2-0 up against a good side away from home. We did none of those. And it's about game management, it's about basic shape, but basic defensive competency. So when we talk about Duffy, we talk about errors, and we talk about him rushing to compensate and perhaps put out fires in places, we have to see it in that context of the framework and the system that he's working in.
Yeah, the overreaching context of all of this is that the centre-backs are not the only issue within the side. It's a much broader conversation in terms of the wing-backs getting forward and nobody there to replace them, and the midfield not having the legs to cover the ground that they need to do that in order to cover the wing-backs who aren't being replaced by another.
Yeah, and the fundamental spacing between the players.
Exactly.
The team is just too stretched.
It's a very old school way of playing football. It's essentially one goes, one stays. If the right wing-back is gone, then your left wing back is pulling in, or if your left wing back is going forward, if you're playing attacking, one of your center defensive midfielders sits and he fills in the gap left there. It's filling gaps with human beings, and if you don't do that, then you get opened up very easily, and that's just the way the football happens. I suppose it's been a very negative show in terms of Shane Duffy and how the defense is going. Before we finish up, we only have about 7-8 minutes left to go. So the Celtic defence at the minute, what I'm taking from this conversation is that Christopher Ayer and Chris Julian, when fit, are the partnership going forward for Celtic, and there's no other arguing against that.
Agreed. Yeah, 100%.
I have a hard time coming up with a scenario where that shouldn't be the case.
Great. Then we've solved, in less than 35 minutes, we have managed to solve the entire issue with Celtic's defence.
Well, back line. Well, let me be a downer quick again. So that's just the center backs. And as you two were just discussing with the fullbacks bombing forward, the issue there becomes one of what's the opportunity cost, right? So we have these two fullbacks that have the freedom to bomb forward, and leaving the flanks exposed with a 35-year-old midfielder having trouble covering. And their output in attack makes me wonder the coherence of that decision. So it's not as if, watching that game on Sunday, I think it was, with Tierney playing wingback for Scotland, was a beautiful reminder of love lost. Right? So his crossing in that game was absolutely terrific, and his ability to get to the byline and cut back, which I think Alan probably knows this better than I even, but I think statistically those kind of crosses are one of the most dangerous in football. So we do not have that anymore. So you had an optimization, let's say, with under a Rodgers system where you had Tierney bombing forward and getting the output from making that decision. Now we have two fullbacks bombing forward, and their end product, and I'll be charitable at this point, is mediocre at best. So we're creating this defensive vulnerability within the context of the status of our midfield, and that end product is not great. So again, I get back to coherence. How is that coherent? How is that, if I think about this within a puzzle, I could see, for example, to me, Bolingoli made more sense conceptually. I'm not saying he's a better player than Laxalt, but he was focused more on going forward. His relative strengths were going forward compared to his defensive output, right? So to me, if you're going to have attacking fullbacks, maybe they should be tilted a little bit more towards the attacking side as far as their output. And I think Laxalt is tilted very heavily in the other direction. And Frimpong is basically a progression star with not a lot on the other two sides, meaning that his passing and crossing and creative ability, and certainly his shooting, which you wouldn't think for a fullback's all that important, but he's so good on the ball. He gets into the box way more than fullbacks normally do. And then he doesn't do anything with it productively.
Well, that's why he was turned into a fullback by Manchester City, because his final third quality. And he's a kid.
He can still maybe develop in that sense. But so we get back to this issue of structure and what are we doing? So these guys bombing forward, they're not great at creating, leaving the defense exposed with a midfielder who's 35. It's like I feel like I'm going nuts.
So you're right. It comes back to what you said about the Duffy recruitment. We've recruited centre backs to play a 4, and we've recruited wide players to play to play wing backs. That's really where we are. Our full backs are actually wing backs, and I would be better suited in a 5, in a 3-5-2, and our centre backs are more suited to a back 4.
Yeah.
And the recruitment reflects both of those things at the same time. And that doesn't make any sense. and it's good to be flexible, right? But you've got to have the players to do that.
And throw in 2 holding midfielders, neither of which are natural holding midfielders, and one who's 35 and in a normal aging decline, and both of which run around a lot, ball chasing. Throw in Duffy ball chasing. I mean, when we discuss this and we look at the numbers and you think about, the eye test, what we have seen, all of this makes sense to the average supporter watching these games. The question is, from an analytics perspective, is could you have seen this coming with competent analysis? And I think that's ultimately, kind of what we're talking about on the show and trying to accomplish, is thinking about, okay, well, we're going to look at historical performance. We're going to look at current performance, and then we're going to try to extrapolate that and look into the future and try to forecast. And I think this was not all that difficult to forecast. It was pretty obvious that these pieces were going to have a tough time fitting together. And that's ultimately what the concern I've been expressing for months now, is I don't understand how these decisions are being made relative to how, to me, somewhat obvious they are. And now we're seeing them reflected on the field. And I think they are obvious to everybody, but yet we still aren't having decisions made to address them structurally.
Yeah.
And we keep saying, well, ultimately, whether or not it's Duffy or Julian, if we don't fix these other problems, these structural problems, they're both going to be left exposed. And we're going to be right back, maybe it'll improve a little bit on the margins relative to Iyer and Julian versus Iyer and Duffy. Maybe the error rate will be lower, but that's still not going to address the fullback issues, the midfield issues. And, it's the old saying about the chain's only as strong as the weakest link. And we've got multiple weak links here.
Yeah. We might come back to the midfield and how that's structured and how that affects the overall performance, but we're right out of time this weekend. Hopefully that we get a better performance, first of all, and a win against Hibernian on 3:00 on this Saturday. And we've been boosted by Iyer being available for this because that was a risk. And before we finish up as well, congratulations to all of our Scottish fans for qualifying for the Euros. It is absolutely brilliant. And as an Irishman, I'm delighted that I'll actually have a team to support at the Euros this year, because it's been fairly depressing watching Celtic and watching Ireland over the last couple of months. Hopefully the performances start to pick up from there. Again, if you want to listen back to this podcast, it's available on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube. It's all over the place, anywhere you want to find it. And you can follow us on Twitter as well, at the Huddle Breakdown. We're on Instagram as well. We'll be sharing out all these statistics, all the graphics, and all the podcasts as well over the next couple of weeks. Hope you enjoyed this episode. James and Alan, thanks very much.
Thanks, Enda. Cheers.
Yeah,
Alan.
thanks, Enda. Take care.